Good morning, Abundant Life Church. This is Pastor Chris, and we're continuing our study on Romans chapter 8, verses 12 down through 17. Where we left off, we were talking about the idea that, yes, Paul had been discussing the concept that we are saved by grace, not by our works. But then he said we have an obligation to live a certain way. We owe God something. Well, that doesn't sound like we're saved by grace if we owe him something. So how does this obligation work exactly? And how do we go about making these payments to God? Is Paul saying that we need to repay God for the gift of Jesus? I think we can pretty safely rule this one out because it's not possible to repay God. That's the whole point of grace, is that we aren't in an equal relationship with God. We cannot repay him for what he's done. So the obligation can't be that we have to square up accounts with God. I don't know what the national debt is. It could be in the trillions of dollars. I don't know. It's not going to be paid off in my lifetime. I know that. But I do know a few years ago, there was a bake sale. Some school decided to have a bake sale to help pay off the national debt. Is that going to do any good? I mean, seriously, you're going to raise what, $200 on that? That's not even enough to pay the debt or to pay the interest on the national debt while you were baking the cookies. It doesn't do anything. It's not a feasible way of paying off the debt. We don't have a feasible way of paying off the debt that we owe God because he gave us Jesus. So we have this obligation that somehow involves behaving ourselves. Obviously, being good doesn't save us. God saves us. And obviously, we cannot repay what we owe God. But apparently, putting sin away does have something to do with this so-called obligation. So how does this all fit together? What is expected of us? Now, it's obvious that God has done so much for us. But is he expecting us to pay it back? He can't be. That doesn't make sense. But Paul still says we have that obligation to God. So how does this work? Well, once we found out what it is that we owe God, then we're going to see exactly how we can repay it. When we realize what we are now because of God, and when we see what he has made us in Jesus, our so-called obligation starts to make sense. Earlier, Paul had used the metaphor of slaves. We were slaves to the sin and slaves to law, but now we're slaves to Jesus. Now, in this passage, though, Paul switches metaphors, and let's see how he describes us this time. Look at verses 14 through 17. For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are God's children, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. Now he's not saying we're slaves. Now he's saying that we're heirs. He's saying that God did more than rescue us from sin. He made us his children. He adopted us. Obviously, being a child is a higher position than being a slave. Now we're part of God's family. Now, if you are part of the family, if you're not a slave, but a part of the family, doesn't that change how you start to see yourself? Back in the time when Paul wrote this in the first century, when a child was adopted, there was a legal ceremony, and they officially handed that child off to his new father. The ceremony had to be done in front of witnesses. The adopted child would now have the father's name, and he would be an heir to the father's estate. The former life of the child no longer existed. He began a completely new life as a member of the family. Everything was changed. So we see that God changes everything. He makes us now an official member of his family. It's like our old life never existed. Now we're his children. Okay, so as a child now, does a child have an obligation to their parents? Yes. Is it one they can ever repay? No. If God made us as children, there are different expectations on us. We have new standards to live up to. Isn't being a child of God an expectation to live a different way? Don't we owe it to him to live up to what he's made us? After all he's done for us, what else could we possibly do? That's our obligation. You belong to God now. You're part of his family. He has transformed you into one of his. So now you are obligated to put away sin. It's not so you can be saved. You're already saved. It's so that you can live as a child. Families have expectations. They do. You are expected to live a certain way. You're expected to meet certain standards. That doesn't mean you're going to stop being a child. There's grace, there's forgiveness. But there's also this idea of remember who you are. Remember who you represent. That's the obligation that God puts on us. Now, we're going to talk about this more, but until then, have a great day.